How surprised were you that this harm being done to you was by women?
I think it depends on demographic. I think the nature of the things I write, I have always mainly been in women's media, so I suppose people who are aware of me tend to be women. But also I do think there's a different way. The way women troll is different from the way men troll. So the way men troll is that they will issue threats, they will issue sexually threatening statements, or they will say something horrible about your appearance, and it will be short, sharp shock. Whereas the way women troll is very systematic, it's very sustained, and it picks apart the things that are very, very close to you.
This video is part of a series tracking and considering matters relevant to the UK government's current strategy for tackling the widespread publication and dissemination of harmful content online. Most specifically, the sort of harmful content that is often described as abusive or trolling, and is also increasingly being referred to as online hate speech.
In the adult world, insults are scaled up. Adults divide more into us and them, inciting violence against others, entire nations, ethnic groups, groups of people by skin color, religion, sex, or abusive comments regarding weight and appearance. These insults are amplified to such an extent that there are now laws throughout the world that govern what is called hate speech.
And in this video, I'm going to take a deep dive into a case study concerning alleged online hate speech, which featured in a recent episode of BBC Radio 4's flagship current affairs series, File on 4. As you will hear, the programme provided a brief update on the progress of the government's online harms paper, and also featured a surprising assessment of the current scope of hate crime legislation by the director of the National Centre for Cyber Stalking Research. It introduced a new, or at least new to me, concept to add to the general genre of online trolling, and most significantly provided a national platform for a BBC Radio regular to set out a very detailed account of her own experience of online trolling that predictably projected a particularly personal perspective onto the story she was being paid public money to tell, and by allowing her to do so unchallenged, potentially breached various sections of the BBC's own editorial guidelines. So, in other words, we have quite a lot to unpack.
What I would say to anyone listening is, if you are ever tempted to engage with a dragging site just because you're interested, just because you'd like to see what's going on, or you think not saying anything or not participating means you're a passive bystander, you are not. What you are helping is the Google results of that site, and then indirectly you are helping to destroy lives. So please, please don't engage with it. Don't jump in the sewer with the rest of the rats.
So, for the uninitiated, File on 4 is Radio 4's flagship investigative journalism programme and is produced by BBC News. Since its first broadcast in 1977, it has won more than 40 radio journalism awards, and in my humble subjective opinion, the recent episode, Me and My Trolls, offers a prima facie case study into just how far the BBC star has sadly fallen in relatively recent years. The episode features resident Guardian journalist Sally Hughes addressing the concern that the COVID pandemic has led to a sharp rise in the number of people being targeted by internet trolls, reporting that one recent survey suggested that nearly half of women and non-binary people have reported experiencing online abuse since the start of the crisis. And setting aside the fact that said survey had a sample size of 500 and by design intentionally failed to capture a reasonable snapshot of the UK's significantly diverse demographic, Hughes's investigation into the impact that anonymous online trolling can have on its victims and what individuals, states and social media providers can do to protect them was entirely built around a narrative directly addressing her own personal experience and perception of people saying hurtful words about her online.
They were rude and vindictive, talking about my children, making accusations about my career that were not and are not true. They dove deep into my family life, researching details about my mother, someone who has recently died horrifically of cancer and with whom I had a painful and extremely difficult relationship since she left when I was a toddler. But I'm fair game because I'm a person whose livelihood depends on honesty. So let's bring her down for the sheer sport of it, all while disingenuously telling each other how righteous we are. They are not righteous. They are internet trolls and bullies. I have found my personal limit, and on behalf of my family, my colleagues, victimised peers, and my own self-respect, I will no longer stay silent.
The centrepiece of her story was an offline encounter with one of her self-identifying abusers, which offered a troubling depiction about the sort of people who are capable of spewing anonymous online hate speech at people like Sally Hughes.
I'm a normal person. I know it might be hard to believe. I'm a normal person. I'm a nice mum. I'm a good friend. And how did somebody normal end up getting involved in something which was so hurtful? When I read back what I wrote, it was so nasty, and I thought, how was I so blind to how thoroughly unpleasant I was being?
A story which, with the assistance of a BPS chartered health psychologist, painted a painful picture of the devastating impact that anonymous online hate speech can have on a victim's mental health. Most specifically, their ability to rationally process and perceive the possibility of realistic threats and danger in real life.
So psychologically, we know there's a lot of harm. We also know behaviours change a lot as well. So people talk about not being able to open their front doors, never trusting strangers on the street because everyone's invisible to you. So if you're threatened with violence or even death by someone who's anonymous, it could be anyone on the platform at the tube station who might push you in front of that train. That sense of threat, when it's linked with anonymity, is devastating and disabling.
It sort of means a lot to me to hear you say that, because I think people really struggle with that part of it. I'm a really independent and bold and self-sufficient person. And in the immediate aftermath of everything that happened to me, I had to go on a business trip, and I couldn't go without my husband, which anybody who actually knows the real me would say is a really unusual thing for me. But I had to take my husband because I felt non-specifically threatened and frightened by people in the street.
An absolutely usual response to this sort of situation.
A health psychologist who is also the director of the National Centre for Cyber Stalking Research at the University of Bedfordshire, and in which capacity claimed to have personally witnessed hate speech that could potentially pass the threshold of what the police and courts will consider to be a criminal offence.
Then I went on and I looked at some of the criminal behaviours that you might notice that were going on there. And the one that sprang out at me, obviously, was hate crime. Regardless of what terms and conditions say, I certainly saw lots of comments that were attacking particularly women about age, appearance. If that sort of hostility is motivated by protected characteristics, whether it be race, sexual orientation, identity, age, disability, those things come under that legislation. You know, they are criminal behaviours. So it was quite an experience to go in there.
A problem in search of a solution, which conveniently led listeners to an update of the progress of the Online Harms Bill, courtesy of the unelected Lord Putnam, chair of the House of Lords Democracy and Digital Committee.
Delayed, and I would suggest rather unaccountably delayed. I mean, it's 18 months now that we've been messing around, and this was described, don't forget at the beginning, as a flagship bill. Very important bill, and indeed it is.
Talk of this bill started in something like 2017, and you have said we may even be looking as late as 2024 for something to actually happen. 7 years strikes me as a long time in the world of the internet.
I described it on a radio not long ago as being a lifetime in the world of the internet. It really is. I mean, 7 years is farcical. If you go back 7 years and look at what your iPhone could do, I think you've been it very quickly. It's a digital lifetime, 7 years.
A problem which, as this particular case study dramatically shows us, can have a devastating impact on public people like Sally Hughes, who can become the salacious subject of gossip or conjecture on so-called dragging sites such as tattle.life.
The anonymity thing is absolutely huge.
MP Jess Phillips.
Because if people were to be held accountable for some of the things they said by their bosses, by their families, I mean, I just wish there was a button on the internet that just said, would you want your mum to see this? Before you press tweet, just like, do you think your mum would be proud of you?
And if the subject, director and narrator of this particular story was to be offered the option of embedding one simple message into the minds of the listener, then my assumption is it would be this.
And I guess I really just kind of hoped that maybe just one or two people on the website might realise the Sally Hughes that's written on there is it's an invention. It's not you. It's someone else who just happens to have the same name.
Now, clearly online abuse is a serious subject. Clearly we all have a collective responsibility to help protect children, vulnerable adults and people with protected characteristics from bullying behaviours online. And as the File 4 episode clearly establishes, Sally Hughes' mental well-being has clearly been deeply affected by her recent experience with so-called dragging sites. But as regular viewers of The Glass Blind Spot will very well know, no matter how thin you slice a matter, there will always be two sides. And it is the predictably substantial side of the story that the BBC documentary only mildly alludes to that merits much closer consideration within the context of a conversation about censorship and calls for governments to rush through relatively draconian measures to protect people like Sally Hughes from so-called hate speech. Draconian measures that could have a quite dramatic impact on discourse and an individual's human right to participate in open, honest and nuanced adult debate. And since Sally Hughes has aligned herself to the side of totalitarian intolerance towards people that she rather dehumanizingly describes as sewer rats, it strikes me as appropriate that she would point yet another spotlight onto MP Jess Phillips and her by now well-documented troubles with people that over the year she has described as, amongst other things, idiots, trolls, free speech warriors, inverted comma libertarians, brocialists, brexiteers, misogynists, internalized misogynists, men's rights activists, the far right, the alt-right, fascist, racist, sexist, homophobic, Islamophobic, you name it, spotty, cardly losers sitting in their underpants in their mother's basement, and more generally, people who are considerably less intelligent or funny than someone better like her.
I am considerably funnier, cleverer, and all round just better than the people who troll me.
Because if you've watched my account of 7 times that Jess Phillips has spoken her particular truth to power, then you may notice how this case study bears some striking similarities with Phillips's own story. Most particularly with the incident that first gave the Yardley MP a national platform to discuss her perspective on anonymous online abuse.
A huge torrent of attacks from men's rights activists.
And to best understand this aspect of the story, we need to rewind to the period immediately preceding what the users of the internet forum that Hughes is keen to shut down describe as Freaky Friday. The day that Sally Hughes recorded and published a relatively rushed statement about her online abuse. I also need to flag the fact that in recent years, steps have been taken to crack down on social media influencers who flout rules around consumer protection or trading and advertising standards by misleading their followers or failing to disclose that they are being paid to promote a product. That Facebook Ireland, who are responsible for the Instagram platform in the UK, have committed to catch influencers on their platform who inadequately label commercial posts and report them to the Competition and Markets Authority. And I also need to introduce the possibility that from some people's perspectives, Sally Hughes may have the potential to be something of a mean girl herself.
She has done a very powerful and important video about how her life has been made hell for the last 3 months by people trolling her, digging into her private life and criticising her parenting, where she says her children, her parenting are off limits. And I have great sympathy for her, all power to her. The reason I'm not one of the thousands of blue tickers literally pumping my public support for her is because the same thing happened to my wife. Her parenting was impugned, she was insulted, a Twitter mob was drawn down upon her because of her parenting, and people said, we pity your children because of the way you parent and your awful husband's parenting. The person who did that to her, the person who started it, was Sally Hughes.
So, for the uninitiated, Sally Hughes is a journalist, writer and broadcaster who, since 2011, has been The Guardian's resident beauty columnist, featuring weekly in its Saturday magazine and on online video tutorials. She also appears weekly on BBC Radio 5 Live, the radio station that she gave an exclusive interview to about her experiences the day after her File on 4 episode first aired.
Do you have any idea why you became a subject?
So, I mean, there are lots of theories on this. I've spoken to psychologists, I've spoken to lawyers. There a certain part of it, I think, is it's a bit like kind of hunting the big game, because my reputation in the field I work in is that I'm the really honest one. I'm the really scrupulously honest one. That has been
We should say you write a lot about beauty, the beauty industry. You write about other things as well, but that's your reputation.
Exactly. And so because I'm kind of known as the uncorruptible person in my industry, which isn't to say there aren't loads of honest people in the industry, because there are heaps of them, but somehow that's kind of ended up being my reputation. And so it was fun, I think. The thought of making accusations of dishonesty about the honest one, I think, was kind of the biggest prize. Also, some of them were disgruntled people who'd been thrown off my public Facebook group for being rude to other members. Some of them were
thrown
annoyed.
off by yourself.
Yes, because they'd said something racist or they'd said something bullying to somebody else. So I just simply removed them from my Facebook group, and that made them angry. But some of them, as I later discovered, just the troll that I met for the documentary, one of her reasons was that she was having a huge problem at the time with a close friend of hers who looked like me. It's just, some of it is so incomprehensible. It's hard to nail a single reason.
She has a significant social media presence with 166,000 followers on Instagram, 137,000 followers on Twitter, and 56,000 subscribers to her YouTube channel, where she regularly interviews friends, celebrities and beauty industry insiders, often discussing their favourite cosmetic brands.
Okay, so Charlotte... This is Charlotte Tilbury. I don't even know why I'm saying that. We don't even need her surname.
The people watching this are beauty nerds. They 100% know who you're talking about. It's all fine.
She is a pretty lady who has become pretty influential within an industry valued at 1.7 billion annually in the UK alone. She has worked hard to develop and project a reputation as being pretty honest, and while doing so, she has built up a pretty big fan base and a following who have come to value her advice about skincare and beauty products, and sometimes even regard her as something of a friend. An aspect of her business model that she has nurtured through ventures such as her Sally Hughes Get the Look Facebook group, which currently has 7,000 members, and through her own stated passion for women and women's issues.
One thing I love is that you're really women, go for it women, you know, you're all about positive women, and I absolutely love that. We work in an industry that is primarily for women, primarily populated by women. It's run by men. But we populate it, and we're the ones with the purses who keep the whole thing afloat. So if you work in this industry and you're not positive about women and you are into slagging women off, then I just think, how dare you? Go and work somewhere else.
I agree.
Ironically, it appears that the majority of Sally Hughes's so-called sewer rats will have been former members of her Get the Look group and genuine fans and followers of her #PrettyHonestAdvice. And I guess that another, perhaps slightly more polite way of describing them might be as previous prolific purchasers of often pricey products, prominently placed in posts and promoted by the so-called Instagram influencer, Sally Hughes. Or even more simply, people sharing pretty honest feedback about their personal customer experience. Consider this statement on the matter from the so-called dragging site. The Sally Hughes threads were started by readers of her Guardian column and followers on social media, who began to have doubts as to whether she lived up to the honesty that she had made her USP. One of the ways in which there appeared to be a lack of honesty was as regards her own face, photographs and videos of which are central to her promotion of beauty products on Instagram. Although it did not appear to be acknowledged, it became apparent from her appearance that she was getting regular Botox injections and possibly other cosmetic procedures. It was seen as dishonest to use her own face to promote beauty products without acknowledging the part played by cosmetic procedures. That her own face is a key part of her Delia effect on sales was illustrated recently when a podcast interviewee was asked what beauty products she used.
I use a combination of different things. I couldn't tell you the name of them though. I'm not really into products, but I buy things because Sally Hughes
tells me to buy them on Instagram, and then I buy them. Because
her skin's incredible.
The first Sally Hughes thread was started in November 2018. This was the first post. She said she'd never do a hashtag ad, and that anything she ever recommended was a true recommendation. Without explanation, she's suddenly started selling shit. In the last month, she has done at least 6 hashtag ads on her stories and posts. So I guess that means she's now a bread and butter influencer. What a shame. Also, Botox. This has been a central theme of the Sally Hughes threads, that a once trusted voice in beauty writing now appeared to be cashing in on the reputation and following she had built up through her Guardian column and was now part of the shady world of online influencing. It is probably fair to say that if Sally Hughes had not initially made a feature of being honest, readers and followers would not have felt so strongly when evidence that suggested the contrary began to appear. And if you think that's harsh, you should hear what they're saying about Chris Chibnall on some of the so-called Doctor Who dragging sites. Or consider this more recent post from one of Sally Hughes's followers who was inspired to find out more after listening to a recent episode of BBC Radio 4's flagship investigative journalism programme. I've been following these threads after the recent documentary, and it's not what I expected having heard it. This seems a necessary conversation. Something has definitely shifted in the tone and in the content of the column, and her Instagram posts now feel a lot more like advertising. It does seem that not addressing this kind of thing is inevitably going to lead people to a forum like this, because asking these kind of questions outright on Instagram or Twitter will result in blocking. One clear inference from this is that so-called Instagram influencers, or people who publish content online for the purpose of engaging with members of the public so as to influence them to buy products, may consciously and carefully curate responses to their content by deleting or creating a hostile environment for people who make negative comments. And it is significant to note that the shutters went up on the comment section of her Guardian column the day after Freaky Friday, and have remained shut to this day. At this point, anyone familiar with the Streisand effect may be wondering why on earth someone with such a large social and legacy media platform would choose to deliberately point her audience towards such a tiny and supposedly rat-infested sewer of a site. Well, By now, the simple answer is clearly that she simply wants to see the entire site shut down, but the initial reason why she very suddenly decided to go public does rather turn this tale of cyber stalking ever so slightly on its head, something which Sally Hughes does in fact briefly acknowledge at one point in her documentary.
In the wider world of the internet, most trolls are enabled and emboldened by anonymity. I identified a number of my trolls through clues left across the internet. In many cases, I liked a public picture of theirs to let them know I saw them, then blocked.
But before we get into all that, indulge me for a moment while I extend a metaphor that I hope will help to place this case study within a wider context that I believe should be of interest to anyone concerned about where we should draw the line between free speech and our collective responsibility to help protect children, vulnerable adults, and people with protected characteristics from bullying behaviours online. And to do this most effectively, I'm going to introduce two famous literary characters created by the author of such classics as The Shape of Things to Come, A Modern Utopia, and War of the Worlds. I'm going to invite you to consider their relevance to a proposed solution to the problem of online trolling that has apparently been copyrighted by none other than one of Sally Hughes' best buddies, author and Times columnist Caitlin Moran.
My key thing is ask me what I would do if I was the Kardashians.
What would you do, Caitlin, if you were the Kardashians?
I would look at Twitter and I would go, this is a wild west of unverified accounts where there are rape and death threats and people publishing each other's home addresses and terrible things are happening, and it's completely destroyed the political discourse in all of the Western world. Why don't the Kardashian family, me and my sisters, with our combined 500 million followers, simply start a new social media platform, a rival to Twitter, where there are no anonymous accounts, everyone is registered and traceable, there are rules of engagement, and if you break them, you're kicked off. We will announce on day one that we're moving over there with our 50 million followers, 500 million followers, and boom, straight away, you've got an up and running social media platform with just as many people on it, but one that someone's put some thought into and gone, this is a nice place where only nice things will happen. That seems not outside the bounds of possibility as a business idea, and I have copyrighted that, and if they ever do it, I will be on a massive back-end deal on that.
So, in his 1895 novel, The Time Machine, H.G. Wells famously envisaged a future where a fork in human evolution would lead to a world populated by two distinctly different descendants of the human race. The Eloi are petite, pretty, childlike adults who most resemble the humans of our age and live a luxurious, albeit banal, easy life on the sparsely populated, luscious garden surface of the earth. Meanwhile, by contrast, the Morlocks are grotesque, chinless, grey-skinned creatures who scuttle about underground within a complex, dark web of sewer-like structures that only occasionally protrude into the daylight world. The protagonist of this much-celebrated science fiction classic concludes that this separation of species must have arisen from a widening gulf between the social classes, caused by some sort of environmental catastrophe, pandemic, or nuclear war. And yet, despite their many differences, it ultimately transpires that the Eloi and the Murlocs have developed something of a symbiotic relationship, with the Murlocs, whose ancestors had long since been driven underground, toiling away in their dark, busy sewers, producing products to feed and clothe the Eloi and provide for their every need, all so that on moonless nights they can venture onto the surface to hunt, capture, kill, and eat their petite, pretty, childlike livestock. Now, obviously, I'm not suggesting that a social media revolution spearheaded by the Kardashians and Caitlin Moran could quite literally become the catastrophic critical incident that leads us to such a dramatic evolutionary fork in the road. After all, there is always Parler. But hopefully you can see how the characteristics of the Eloi and Murlocs can easily be projected onto the conflicting narratives apparent in virtual abuse case studies such as this. For example, one such narrative might be the portrayal of Sally Hughes as a pretty, honest and innocent victim being hunted for sport by hardly humanoid troll-like creatures. Hardly humanoid troll-like creatures that, in Wells's novel, are afraid of sunlight and can easily be repelled by an adult human unless they come at you as a pack. From such a perspective, one might consider it to be entirely reasonable and sensible for Sally Hughes to utilise any weapon or person or spotlight available to fight off her tormentors. But even so, it doesn't necessarily follow that her quite stunning and brave decision to transform from hunted into hunter is necessarily going to be seen by all as a proportionate or even rational act of self-defence.
The moment I felt a bit more in control of what had been a really, really traumatic situation was when I had a piece of paper in front of me with everyone's name, their job, where they worked, where they lived.
Because then you're accountable.
If you put your mind to it, it's quite easy to find out who everyone is. Loads of them, what seemed to me like a sea of people who hated me, were actually about 20 people with multiple accounts who were kind of school teachers and nurses and legal secretaries and people mostly in regulated professions. There was somebody who worked at an adoption agency. It's just really shocking.
Regulated professions where, in this age of instant cancel culture, employers might easily be convinced to cancel contracts if suddenly startled by a social media storm and the intense legacy media glare that sometimes, but certainly not always, seems to follow close behind. Now, obviously, I'm not saying that the woman quite literally on Sally Hughes's list of mean girls quite literally became worried that she might attempt to make arrangements for a convicted paedophile to call at their door and demand satisfaction on her behalf. But the following statement prepared by Tattle.life users does appear to indicate that there is at least as much evidence to support the legitimacy of such a concern, certainly when compared to Sally Hughes's own stated concerns about the people she passes on the streets or stands next to on busy railway platforms. From around September 2019, Sally Hughes has attempted to put a stop to the discussion here. Her initial strategy seemed to be to try to intimidate people individually. People here started noticing that she or her assistant or unknown high-profile friend were stalking them around their social media, leaving evidence that they had engaged with or viewed their social media accounts. At the time, the website Estee Laundry had been posting information about alleged bullying at the brand Charlotte Tilbury.
Estee Laundry.
Laundry. It's a
That's a
whistleblower
great
account.
name.
It's a good name. It's a whistleblower account who will publish literally anything.
This led to comments both on Tattle and on Sally Hughes's Instagram, suggesting that Sally Hughes, who appeared to have been a friend of Charlotte Tilbury and a promoter of the Charlotte Tilbury brand, should be adding her voice in support of the alleged victims. This appeared to have been the prompt for this first attempt to silence the discussion here. A number of contributors to the thread said that they felt intimidated by the stalking. One said she was leaving Tattle because of it. This is what she posted on Thursday the 26th of September 2019. Yesterday morning, I received a notification that Sally Hughes had liked a Facebook post of my children. This seemed very odd. It was one of a few photos that I had mistakenly left on a public setting. My feed would have had to be scrolled down quite far to find this photo. Later that morning, I realised that I'd been blocked from the Sally Hughes Get the Look group and from her Instagram. I didn't make many comments on her pages and I was always very polite. Therefore, she must have read my posts here and done some detective work to discover my identity. I feel really creeped out, particularly as she had involved my children. I've enjoyed my time on Tattle.life, but I'm leaving now as I feel very uneasy. To bring attention to this behaviour, the above post was sent to Estee Laundry, who posted it on their website with the comment, multiple people claiming to be unnerved by the way Sally Hughes and her assistant are stalking them on Facebook.
There's no fact checking, there's no verification. It's, as a journalist, it makes me a bit nuts that people believe what they say, because they will publish literally anything.
Estée Laundry later posted another comment stating that so many direct messages about British beauty columnist Sally Hughes, intimidating anyone who's been asking about Charlotte Tilbury makeup bullying allegations by stalking them on social media. This is very bizarre. These posts appeared on the Estée Laundry website on the 26th and 27th of September 2019. On the evening of Friday the 27th of September, Sally Hughes posted a video on her Instagram account describing herself as the victim of bullying. From both the timing and the content of the video, it appears that she had posted it in response to her stalking of Tattle members having become public.
So I had to make a statement, which was hard for me because I'm a really private person, but I had no choice, because within 5 minutes of them reporting me to Estée Laundry, I was just getting messages from all over the world insulting me, saying I was harassing people.
The approach she appeared to take was to wildly exaggerate the harm being done, especially to her family and friends, in order to justify behaviour that might otherwise have been considered harassment. In effect, to use attack as a form of defence.
Anyway, in the end, Estée Laundry took it down shortly afterwards when they realised that they'd made a grave error, and I had a conversation with them behind the scenes.
She received an enormous amount of sympathy for the ordeal she and her family had suffered, and admiration for her bravery in confronting the bullies. In addition to support from her thousands of followers, she received public support from well-known figures who themselves have huge social media followings. As well as offering support, a number of followers piled on with abuse of Tattle members. Sunday Times journalist and known Sally Hughes' friend, India Knight, was one of the most prominent. In one tweet that evening, India Knight wrote, "E, does she know where they live? I would slightly like to know this too, in fact." It was known that E referred to India Knight's partner, former MP Eric Joyce, who is known to have been convicted for assault. That he was inquiring as to where 4 members lived appeared threatening. Sally Hughes' reply, literally yes, suggested that she had pried into Tattle members' lives to the extent that she knew where they lived.
As I found out who most of them are, in fact, I now know who loads of them are. I've got the names and location and jobs of pretty much all of them now.
Although the overwhelming response to the video was support for Sally Hughes, some who had seen it then came to the Sally Hughes threads on Tattle to see for themselves what this bullying was all about. Finding it to be very different from the video's description led some to view Sally Hughes in a new light. For example, one newcomer commented, "Up till then I'd found Sally Hughes a bit irritating and perhaps not quite living up to her honesty USP, but hadn't thought about it much. I was now outraged by her attempt to use the power and influence of her hundreds of thousands of followers to close this down, a small discussion forum with, at the time, maybe 30 members. It seemed as if, having pretty well shut down criticism and dissent in her own social media, she was now seeking to shut it down across the entire internet. Part of my reason for joining here was to show solidarity with this oppressed minority. So, again, anyone who's watched the Glass Blind Spot episode 7 times that Jess Phillips, MP, spoke her particular brand of truth to power.
I'm a defender of the freedom of speech. It is not the freedom to insult and silence people like me.
May now have noticed something of a familiar pattern emerging. And I say emerging because, as the MP for Birmingham Yardley has consistently shown us, once you attempt to coercively control a narrative,
I would personally like to see further action of getting rid of people from these platforms who we know. And actually, we could really hurt them by damaging their brand, by taking it off air.
Over time, things have a tendency to escalate in all sorts of unexpected and sometimes headline-grabbing ways.
His name's Sargon Akkad online, but his real name is Carl Benjamin. He lives in Swindon.
To the extent that you even find yourself making outrageous claims live on BBC One.
Their hands are tied in this situation because people like me in Westminster didn't do enough to stop
what is essentially the rise of fascism.
Outrageous claims that tend to propel the protagonist with the public platform towards championing tyrannical solutions in an attempt to solve the uncontrollable problem of people posting pretty honest feedback or even mean words about you on the World Wide Web.
We need to regulate the internet in far, far, far greater. That's the head of Google saying if we put onerous regulations on it, Google will move out of the UK, and I'd just like to say, see you later.
No matter how thin you slice a thing, there will always be two sides. We're all adults here, and you, dear viewer, are entirely capable of making your own mind up with regards to the question as to, at any given point in this story, whom might reasonably be perceived to be trolling or dogpiling or harassing or even stalking whom. But obviously this is far from the first time that we've seen an industry or interest area infected by allegations from insiders claiming that their fans, followers or customers have suddenly turned on them in all sorts of nasty and unfashionable ways. Such a phenomenon presumably predates 2014 and the infamous Gamergate controversy, which ultimately led to an intervention by the FBI. Since then, this phenomenon has spread to all sorts of areas of popular culture.
Everyone in this room is a horrible, sexist, misogynist, loser, scumbag. How could this happen?
And it appears that we can now add Prettygate to a depressingly lengthy list. And of course, every time these incidents emerge, calls for tighter regulations, deplatforming and action to address perceived online hate speech inevitably follow close behind. And it is in this particular context that I believe this grubby little story about the Instagram influencer and the mean girl Morlocks of Tattle.life should be especially troubling to anyone concerned about where we draw the line between free speech and our collective responsibility to help protect children, vulnerable adults and people with protected characteristics from bullying behaviours online. Consider again the testimony provided by the documentary's most significant expert witness.
Emma Short is a psychologist and expert in cyber harassment and cyber stalking. She spent some time looking at the site hosting the trolls who attack Katie and me on a daily basis. She came to some pretty damning conclusions.
Then I went on and I looked at some of the criminal behaviours that you might notice that were going on there. And the one that sprang out at me, obviously, was hate crime. Regardless of what terms and conditions say, I certainly saw lots of comments that were attacking particularly women about age, appearance. If that sort of hostility is motivated by protected characteristics, whether it be race, sexual orientation, identity, age, disability, those things come under that legislation. You know, they are criminal behaviours. So it was quite an experience to go in there.
Given that all four nations of the UK do indeed now appear to be slowly but surely moving towards extending hate crime protections to include behaviours motivated by a person's sex or age, it struck me that the expert opinion offered by the director of the University of Bedfordshire's self-styled National Centre for Cyberstalking was highly significant indeed. A centre which, according to their website, is regularly called upon by the police, policymakers and parliamentarians to provide expert witness evidence concerning the experience and impacts of cyber stalking and harassment online. And a director who the presenter and writer of the BBC documentary has described as the single most important interview subject, and someone who she thanked personally for helping her and taking the time to hang out in the sewer. It's unclear as to what aspect of this testimony was considered to be most particularly helpful, but troublingly, the casual listener could be forgiven for believing that Dr. Short had returned from the sewers with ample evidence of not just criminality and hate speech, but even threats of death or violence directly aimed at Sally Hughes.
Everyone's invisible to you, so if you're threatened with violence or even death by someone who's anonymous, it could be anyone on the platform at the tube station who might push you in front of that train. That sense of threat, when it's linked with anonymity, is devastating and disabling.
It sort of means a lot to me to hear you say that, because I think people really struggle with that part of it. I'm a really independent and bold and self-sufficient person. And in the immediate aftermath of everything that happened to me, I had to go on a business trip, and I couldn't go without my husband, which anybody who actually knows the real me would say is a really unusual thing for me. But I had to take my husband because I felt non-specifically threatened and frightened by people in the street.
An absolutely usual response to this sort of situation.
Presumably, producers may very well have edited such testimony to best fit the sort of story they wanted to tell. I mean, how else could they have managed to broadcast a definition of cyber victimization that was as vague and yet all-encompassing as this?
But if you look at terms of things like victimisation, victimisation or cyber victimisation, it's any repeated behaviour or attention over time by an individual or a group towards the victim. That's victimisation.
But I was particularly struck by the apparently informed inference that the simple act of criticising or attacking a person might now be considered to be a criminal offence if that criticism can be shown to relate to an aspect of their age or sex. Because, after all, common sense dictates that a discussion about beauty, Botox and skincare products will almost inevitably involve mention of those two potentially soon-to-be protected characteristics. My extensive searching did at least identify a few examples where one or both characteristics are explicitly mentioned in posts, but they strike me as relatively tame. So I reached out to Dr. Short and asked her if she could provide some examples of the sort of language or behaviour that she perceived to be hate speech or criminal under UK law. Regrettably, Dr. Short advised that it wasn't possible for her to comment on this because she was at capacity getting lectures and online materials sorted for her university students. And when I asked her if she had made an assessment of the credibility of the counter-allegations of cyber stalking specifically directed at Sally Hughes, predictably enough, I received no further reply. That being said, Dr. Short didn't disagree with my assertion that the comments she described in the documentary are highly unlikely to pass the threshold into criminality, given that age and sex are not currently characteristics protected under hate crime laws. Indeed, my assessment regarding the credibility of the claims made by the BBC expert witness would be that they appear to be problematic, to say the very least. Because for an action to be considered to be motivated by hatred towards a group, at least in law first and foremost, that action has to be recognised as criminal behaviour in and of itself. And to date, there appears to be very little evidence to support the assertion that the actions of Tattle.life users would be recognised as criminal if considered by a court of law. Quite the opposite, in fact. For example, in the hours that followed Sally Hughes' September 2019 statements, not one but two employees of GoDaddy, the web hosting service for Tattle.life, contacted her on Twitter to say that they would be raising her plight at work on Monday morning because, based on her testimony, they believed that the website had very clearly breached their terms of service. And yet, the site remains up to this day. Several other disgruntled influencers have reported it to the police, complaining about bullying, harassment, discrimination and more. And yet to date, no prosecutions have been progressed. The MP, Helen Whatley, has even intervened in Parliament, calling on the Home Office to investigate the site. And yet, no investigation was opened. And despite claiming to have the name and addresses of the people she has publicly accused of harassment, defamation and hate crimes, 12 months on, Sally Hughes has yet to pursue any legal action herself. Clearly, slander and defamation can have very serious consequences for someone's business or reputation, but England does have some of the most robust defamation laws in the world, and their reach certainly isn't exclusive to obscure online gossip sites. For example, in 2012, Guardian columnist George Monbiot reached an out-of-court settlement with a member of the Conservative Party, which involved a commitment to carry out 3 years of charity work as recompense for just one abusive tweet. Tattle.life is, by its own admission, a gossip site with a particular but not exclusive focus on social media influencers. It states that it allows users to comment and critique people that have chosen to monetize their personal life as a business and release such information into the public domain. Many of the comments posted can certainly be catty, but having read through the entire 150 odd pages of comments that provoked Sally Hughes's public statement, my assessment would be that the discussion had primarily focused on constructive criticism of her business practices and her approach to working within the heavily regulated journalism profession. Where the discussion did veer towards her friends and family, this involved subject matter that Sally Hughes had herself already put into the public domain, and in the main appeared to be mentioned in the wider context of a discussion involving a group of former fans or customers of Sally Hughes who had come to suspect that she may not always live up to her own self-styled unique selling proposition of being the pretty honest one, and a reliable narrator about her own very public life. In fairness, I have no doubt that discovering an obscure conversation thread where former fans or followers have gathered to essentially slag you off would indeed be an unpleasant experience. But then again, judgmental or critical commentary about people in public life is permitted across numerous media formats, and Tattle.life users have also pointed to examples where Sally Hughes has behaved in ways very similar to her own complaint. So at the very least, this tale reeks of double standards. At the end of the day, it strikes me that pretty petite people like Sally Hughes would struggle to live in the manner they're accustomed to without maintaining such strange, symbiotic social contracts with strangers who essentially stalk them online and feed on the products they are sometimes paid to sell. It is noticeable that Hughes's Instagram posts do now feature very regular disclaimers or detail about the exact type of relationship she has with the product makers she promotes. And from that perspective, portraying members of her fan base who have perhaps outlived their usefulness as rats, trolls, and fucktards just strikes me as an unnecessarily high-risk business strategy. But more importantly, journalists like Sally Hughes may quite possibly be comfortable with the possibility of exploiting or appropriating very serious concepts like abuse and hate crime for the purpose of smearing or silencing the wrong sort of woman. But if doing so, in the long term, ultimately they endanger everyone's human right to open, honest adult discourse. And in the immediate, they undermine the plight and lived experiences of thousands of victims of abuse and crime, be it online or in the real and sometimes very cruel world.
Can't you see it too? There's an elephant in the room.